Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this blustery afternoon at the end of the day for our first Lightning Lounge of the year. And this Lightning Lounge, we celebrate the work of our faculty at the branch campuses. So we're lucky to have four outstanding faculty from each of our branch campuses today. A reminder that Lightning Lounge is brought to you by Academic Affairs. My name is Christopher Lyons. I'm an Assistant Vice Provost in Academic Affairs for faculty, and also in collaboration with Advance at UNM, the Office for the Vice President for Research, and the Center for Teaching and Learning. If you're new to Lightning Lounge, it's an unusual format. It's called Lightning because we have very quick kind of discussion or presentations from our four faculty here. So we're asking them to talk for 7 minutes, and then we'll have 6 minutes of Q&A after each presentation. So we'll really try to keep it to that time so that we can get everyone in. But if, it'll be quick kind of conversations about extremely detailed research and ideas. So that's the challenge, but also the fun of the event. All right. So with that, I'm going to admit a couple more people, but with that, we're going to get started here. We're going to go with Christopher Dyer first, and then proceed to the other three presenters. Christopher Dyer is a professor of anthropology at UNM-Gallup, and as you can see here, his presentation is on the Bahali Community Action Response Team training, and look forward to hearing about your work. Christopher, all yours.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Dyer. I've spent the last umpteen years doing research with disasters and doing community-based research from Exxon Valdez oil spill to hurricanes to floods all over the world. This is a community-based research focusing on creating disaster resilience for rural communities, indigenous and non-indigenous, and here in New Mexico. This is supported by our Grand Challenge project, and we're starting in Navajo land with a couple of chapter houses out there, one of which is Bahali. Next slide. We're trying to create sustainable community action response teams, what I call CARTs, that can prepare people to mitigate disasters, hazards, and threats to their life safety and quality of life. It says Cochiti community because I'm working in Rio Grande Pueblo communities as well as ones out in Navajo land. Next slide. The Bahali Chapter House is where we're focused right now, and these are some of the people that are involved in the research. We have people from UNM main campus, UNM-Gallup, as well as Dr. Bill Kennedy from George Mason University, Center for Social Complexity. Next slide. These are some of the things that in a pilot with the Church Rock community chapter house, we identified wildfires, radiation contamination, severe weather events, drought, potable water contamination from heavy metals, human impacts and losses from COVID, and a train derailment and potential toxic hazard release. Next slide. CART started out in North Carolina. I had a grant from Blue Cross Blue Shield and worked with 1,100 people in 10 different community sites, mostly through church networks, and developed the model, the Community Action Response Team. Next slide. In Bahali, we're training people to be citizen volunteers. At this point, when we started out with the Church Rock, prior to this, we did surveys with 245 households and household heads, and have using the lessons learned from that project to spur us forward with what we're going to do with the Bahali Chapter House and several on the Rio Grande corridor. Next slide. What does the CART actually do? It creates a sense of awareness, provides training and emergent response plan with civic leaders, and proactively communicates to everyone risks and provides networking support and access to emergency resources to let people be aware and be prepared to take care of themselves at least within the first 72 hours after an event. Next slide. Okay, the Community Action Response Team is something that is needed right now. If we could go on to the next slide, I'm going to try to speed this up. And accepts that governments can't do everything, that we need citizen volunteers to be able to provide the support that people need on the ground at the moment things happen. And so if you're elderly, if you're disabled, if you have little chance for transportation out of a disaster event, we need to be aware of you and be ready to help you. Next slide. Okay, this talks about how we actually did it, create cart buddies and teams. And we did exercises called mock drills where we're practicing the disaster drill and getting people to come to a central contact point and then call all clear and talk about the outcomes. Next slide. Why do we need CART now? And I'm putting this in global context because it's a global issue. Next slide. It's because of disaster compression. This is an accelerated shift in frequency and severity of events that's threatening societies and communities to restore to their equilibrium afterwards, where you have one thing occurring after another. And the outcomes can be societal or communal decline or even death. And this goes back, has happened various points in time with massive changes in climate and other events such as tsunamis and hurricanes and floods. Next slide. This gives you a visual of what disaster compression is doing in our timeline. Goes back and starting in 1980 to 1990. These represent decadal events of $1 billion that have been occurring in recent times. As you can see from the first line to the last one. The last one, 2011 to 21, 165 events. Back in 1980 to 90, 34. So there is a trend here, and it's accelerating, and it makes it difficult for people to respond and get back on their feet as one after the other happens, and often they're very much worse than they have been in the past. Next slide. Why we have to self-protect, and self-preserve, because we don't have the resources, we don't have the people, and the ability to be able to manage all of this. Next slide. And this is an activation team. It's not working all the time. It's like a volunteer fire department. It kicks into view when you have a community crisis, disaster, or hazard. Next slide. Okay, the next slide, please. These are some of the steps that we take. We're in the very doing this with a team of about 12 people and 6 students. Next slide, please. This is what the team looks like, and from a leadership perspective, there's a prime leader, transportation, procurement, communication, and volunteers, all who work together and are trained through our mock drills to be effective as a team when disaster strikes. Next slide. We give them go kits and generate these go kits. Walmart has given us some funds to help with the materials that go in the go kits. Next slide. You want these by your door. Okay, these are the rules. Let's going to skip over these of what the leaders do. Next slide. Next slide. This is for training, so that's why it's like this. Ranking your community in terms of disaster. Next slide. Family planning. We encourage every household to have a plan to escape and to know how they're going to get out and with whom. Next slide. We collect critical information for households, which we did for 245 in our pilot with Church Rock. Next slide. And these are kind of the things you would put in a go kit. When a go kit is used, power is out, you can't get food or water easily. And so these are all the kinds of things that you might need to be put in there and have it ready to go by the door when something strikes. Next slide. We had a mock disaster drill, and we're going to be doing another one with the 4 communities we're working with in the near future. Next slide. Immediate steps, and these are the steps we take. Next slide. Positive outcomes. We save lives, we speed recovery, regenerate community, and improve mental and physical health. People getting out and volunteering, we know, is good for your mental health as well as your physical health. And we need more volunteers in the world. To go along with what you saw in terms of increasing disasters, there's a group called VOED, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster, and they have increased by tenfold since the mid-1960s in terms of their numbers and effectiveness. Next slide. Rapid first response, working together, providing mutual aid, knowing how to do it. That is a drill, is important. Next slide. Speeding recovery, improve knowledge of agencies and how do you get help, improve communication and working together. Recovery is quicker when we collaborate. Next slide. Getting to know your neighbors. This is reification of community. If you're a sociologist, Christopher, you know that this is something that's happened in the last 40, 50 years as communities become more independently isolated, even within the common areas. Sharing frameworks, acting as a social support network, breaking down isolation. Isolation is just as deadly as smoking cigarettes. Next slide. Decrease isolation, doing things together, sharing talking circles, reducing stress and trauma are all outcomes. Next slide. Okay, worsening the impacts from flood, drought, and other catastrophes all reflect a decrease in the sustainability of human systems. And it is a warning to humankind to listen carefully to the voices of vulnerability. For as Pogo once said, we have seen the enemy and he is us. Dyer 2003. Thank you guys very much.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. So questions, you are free to put them in the chat, but we would like to hear your voice too. So feel free to unmute and ask a question. I'll ask the first one if you don't mind. So do your plans vary depending on the expectation of the event? So I mean, if it's fire, if it's water, or some other type of
Yes,
yeah.
we hopefully will prepare people to be able to respond to a variety of events, which are common out here in the Southwest. Our first step is wildfires. We're working with communities that are susceptible. Bahali is very susceptible to wildfires. One of the other communities working with is Hemis Springs, which is in a box canyon surrounded by dead and dying pinyon pines because of the bark beetles. Yeah, we are starting with wildfires, and then we will go on as we expand, hopefully to hit, within 5 to 10 years, practically all the communities, rural communities that we can identify who are at risk in New Mexico.
Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. This is Renya. Thank you for that presentation. And I was interested in hearing more about how the community members responded.
The community members initially were very reluctant to some degree because they didn't understand why this was important. But we've had a whole series of talking circles and broken down some of those communication barriers, and they're now very much engaged in cooperating, collaborating, which is difficult because in many of our rural communities, we're dealing with poverty, which when you're poor, you don't volunteer. You don't get involved as much as you would if you're well off. So that's both a challenge that we have, but the outcomes so far have been very good. The people that we're working with are very enthusiastic and encouraging, particularly the community leaders, and getting this done and setting up these community action response teams and other kinds of pieces of work we're doing with them for disaster prevention.
Great, thank you.
Time for a couple more questions.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. That was great. I am curious how your relationships with area emergency services is, and do you work alongside local fire departments, EMS organizations, law enforcement, et cetera?
Yeah, we engage at the beginning. I have actually talking circles internally in their departments. For example, our upcoming work we're going to be doing in Hemis Springs. We started with the police department and the EMS department, and they're starting a nerve center of response, and then we'll be doing gatherings of people. Will be invited to come, and then we'll be going out to households to help prepare them and let them know what we're doing. They're on the verge of being really at risk because of the pinyon pine issues and the fact that they're in a box canyon. There's only one way in and out. So they're very, very eager with the police department, EMS, and other individuals there to work with us who are in positions of leadership. You always have to start with them because they're part of the response It's a combination of that team of human beings and their capacities and the individual households and groups of neighborhoods, as well as, let's say, chapter houses that you can pull together. And it's making the first responders aware of what you're trying to do proactively so that collaboration can be more effective when a disaster occurs.
One more question. Here's a question for you, Christopher. How, in terms of publishing this work, I see you cited yourself at are you publishing this as community engaged research with partners, or is this kind of about the process, the practice, your experience in other projects?
It's going to be a combination of both. A lot of the conceptual modeling, like the concept of disaster resilience and what I call the cultural response, and another term, punctuated entropy, which is like bang, 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 things going bad. That's all coming out in a book, Anthropological Perspectives on Hazards and Disasters. That's a Journal of Social Science publication, will be much later this year. And then these individual reports will be prepared for training purposes and practical gray literature purposes internally with each one of the communities that we work with. So they have a live document that's the outcome and result of what we did with and for them, but something that can be updated and used in praxis, not something that's going to sit on a shelf. We're also going to be pulling out other kinds of publications from those particular reports and these gatherings, like the pilot we did with Church Rock. And we're publishing that first gray literature for the EMS department through the Office of the President of Navajo Nation. So it'll depend upon who we're working with at what phase. But there's another journal I use, Practicing Anthropology. We'll put some of these things in that as well.
We have a question
so both gray literature and published community engaged scholarship.
Great, thank you much. All right, so we should move on to the second presenter. Thank you so much, Dr. Dyer, for your presentation and for your work on this.
Okay.
Moving on to Virginia Grant, who is Assistant Professor of English at UNM-Los Alamos, whose presentation is Landscapes, Trees, and Senses of Place in 20th Century American Poetry.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so concepts of what it means to be American are commonly influenced by the landscape of the nation. So think, for example, about the lyrics to America the Beautiful, amber waves of grain, purple mountains majesty, this sort of thing. So these ideas of identity, including notions of how place are identified apart from geographical location, are present also in literary landscapes. My current work is focusing on identifying those types of landscapes in 20th century American poetry. So today I'm going to focus on one poet, perhaps the most famous American poet of the last century, and that's Robert Frost. So the forest, woodlands, and trees in forest poetry reflect and influence ideas about America and what it means to be American. Frost poetry also impacts the identities of American spaces, the very trees, forests, and landscapes that are the subjects or features of his poetry become part of American culture. So I'm thinking about geographical location, but I'm also thinking about cultural location. So let's think for a moment about Robert Frost, a very famous poet, both during his lifetime and after his death. David Orr has called him part of the bedrock of American identity, a very strong statement, and also a public figure in a way that no other American poet has even come close to managing. I am guessing, for example, many of you are not scholars of 20th century American literature, but I'm also guessing that almost all of you have some level of familiarity with the poetry of Robert Frost, right? And something I really think illustrates that significance is that, not that, here's Frost with the Kennedys, for example, at a White House dinner. And just a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK actually sent Robert Frost to the Soviet Union. And while he was there, he had a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. And this, I think, really demonstrates Kennedy's faith in Frost as like a cultural ambassador for the United States at that time, right? So that kind of puts that in context. And then to situate sort of where I'm defining these readings of Frost, I want to briefly provide the context of eco-criticism. Okay, so the short version is this. Centuries ago, forests not appreciated the way that they are now. They were scary, right? People went in, they didn't come out. We've all read the fairy tales, yeah. Then Romanticism comes along. The Romantics are really focused on things like the wonder of nature, and things take a turn. People start to read that poetry and they're really appreciating trees and whatnot, right? So the human appreciation of nature through art and literature is developed at that point. That translated forward into more like 20th century ideas of a preservation, respect, and care of nature. A big example I would give you of that is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a book about the pesticide DDT that changed a lot about that. In the 21st century, a lot of what we're looking at in eco-criticism is the way that literature addresses and influences ideas about things like climate change, deforestation, and senses of place, which is what I'm talking about today. So when we're thinking about senses of place, we can layer these different ideas to see how they're influencing, reflecting, and interacting with each other. For Frost poetry, I'm thinking about spaces like America, American culture, and American literature, all as spaces. We can also think about like Frost's place in Americana. If you think back to that photo I showed you of Frost with the Kennedys, right? It's that sort of idea of where he falls there. And then I'm looking at how those poems function in regard to ideas about Americanness, which is the word that I like to use for that. So to give a quick example, I'm going to point to what is probably Frost's most famous poem, which is The Road Not Taken. Many of you probably know this poem, or you at least know a line from it, right? So I'm not going to just read the whole thing to you, but it has at this point taken on a life of its own, particularly with the last stanza where it says, "Two roads diverged in a wood. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." The concept of taking the road less traveled has come to be commonly understood in American culture in particular as a positive take on individuality. And that is often translated into being an American trait. So what I have been looking at lately is how that's accomplished by using trees and the forest as a map for decision and indecision, and continuing readings of that poem and its place in American culture. So you'll see we're layering all these things together. So I think of it as an arboreal reading. In my field, we do historical readings and cultural readings. And so I like to think of it as an arboreal reading. I'm really looking at the forests, the trees in the poem, and considering how they function. So Frost wrote a great deal about New England, particularly New Hampshire, but he was actually living in England in the UK when he wrote this poem. Both places, however, have birch trees in their woods, which is a tree that Frost writes about, very famous poem, Birches, for example. And then actually in the mid-20th century, the birch tree became the state tree of New Hampshire. So this layer of American ideals, individualism, adventurism, and independence in particular, onto this poem about trees really lends an Americanness to the trees themselves. And in turn, the Americanness of the trees lends itself to the poem's perceived ideals. So these things are influencing each other, and that's continuing on, right? These are some more quotes from David Orr about the significance of the road not taken, that it plays a role not just in literature, but in culture. The phrases are ubiquitous. There are tons of examples of this. I've seen it on like Banana Republic campaigns, a Gap t-shirt, car commercials. And it is the most widely read and recalled American poem of the past century. He claims that's not, like, we can't literally document that, but that's sort of the concept, right? So those traits, right, American individuality, independence, exploration, are also the traits that define the trees and the forest also as American. For example, one of the most famous lines is "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood," and the wood there is really important. Now, whether or not the poem is actually encouraging individualism is a talk for another day, but I encourage you to read this poem closely, line by line, and think about that. That's always fun. And finally, to give you a quick sense of how this thread is developing in my research, I was for many years a scholar of the writer Flannery O'Connor. My most recent work on O'Connor was on sense of place, regional identity, and landscapes, which I studied in part at her farm in Milledgeville, Georgia. And I also recently did some work on Washington Irving's story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, discussing how trees and forests in that short story function as cultural boundaries to define Americanness. So I'm continuing that in this work on frost. And then that same legacy is continued in later American poets like Mary Oliver. And I imagine that's where my work is likely headed next after I finish a great deal more work on frost. So thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Virginia, given the present climate of our nation and the world, do you think that there is a shift in people's perception and value of nature itself and what it presents through art and literature?
I would have to think about that one for several days. I think let's see. I mean, I will say that very recently there has been sort of a flurry of work related to trees, right, and in American literature. And the biggest example probably being Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory. And so, which I think won a Pulitzer. Take that with a grain of salt. I don't have notes on it right now. But so I think there has been a lot of stuff recently written about that. I'm still back in the 20th century and I haven't worked my way up chronologically just yet, but I am paying attention to that as it occurs, right? And I think that eco-criticism is really growing. Environmental studies, environmental humanities are fields that are really expanding, which I think is having a huge impact on a number of things. Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is particularly cool about that is the opportunity for all those fields to collaborate, right? So I'm always thinking about, right, like how can science classes work with literature classes, and how can we look at all these things together, to see what sort of really significant impact literature is having, because, my students don't always believe it at first, right? But yes, it does have a big impact, right? So yeah, so I hope that at least in part answers your question. Thanks. Thank you.
I have a question, Virginia, that my name is Carol Faust, and I teach in education and human services. I am really wondering about the Americanism, or what was the terminology you used?
The word I use is Americanness.
Americanness?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you're seeing like a differentiation through different age groups or different people's perceptions of Americanness, and like the idea of people that have never been to a forest. And does that affect maybe their view or their concept of Americanness versus somebody who really has soaked in the forest or spent a lot of time in the forest and has like a different relationship with trees versus somebody that maybe they've seen a tree in a park, but they've never been to a forest?
That's such an interesting question. I love the layers of that, like the idea that like you could see a picture of a tree versus a painting of a tree, read a poem about a tree, go see a tree in a city park, go to a natural growth forest, that type of thing. I have done zero work on that. I will just be real with you. But I think it's super interesting, and I don't know how, this field is actually fairly new to me. So when I was looking at things with O'Connor, that was more about landscapes and farm landscapes and tree lines on farms and things. So now that I'm looking more specifically at forests, I haven't really had an opportunity to talk with students much about it yet. But I am totally going to keep that in mind as I hopefully get that opportunity, because I think that's a fascinating idea. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to follow up, there's a program that some of my students were involved in Colorado, where they had a grant to bring like every fifth grade student to a forest like 4 times during their fifth grade year. And then they did some research around that. So it was extremely interesting because a lot of those kids, even though they were 45 minutes away from a forest, they had never been to a forest.
Oh, that is really interesting. Yeah.
And how that
Okay.
impacted them and their learning and their insights to the earth, but also their insights about themselves and how they learn. So yeah, there is some research out there on that I think would really integrate with literature and with collaborative or interdisciplinary learning like you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. There is a lot of work on things like the benefits of just going into a forest of there's like this book called The Nature Fix, right? About just like the benefits of nature and being surrounded by nature and trees for humans, right? So there is a lot of current work being done on that. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how that ties to like middle school kids who've never gone into a forest before, right? And
Right. And how
what
you
kind of impact that
and how
has.
you integrate the science of the earth, because that's what they do. They take them 4 times a year and they do science lessons. Then they're collecting data on how it's impacting them as a person and their learning capabilities. So just a thought.
Thank you.
Want
That is cool. I'm going to look that up.
to jump in and have let Brent ask your question. Hopefully we can answer it too, but we only have like a minute. So
Okay, so really quickly, on Carol's question, there's also the book Last Child in the Woods, which speaks to that place-based learning, educational settings in woods and other natural settings. My question pivots a bit though. So Jenny, there's other prominent poets, not with the same level of presence as Robert Frost, but figures, I don't know, like Allen Ginsberg, who had a poem called America, right? Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Anne Sexton, who speak to an America that's considerably more urban. And I was wondering how that connects to this idea of Americanness.
Well, I think that I'd have to look at it sort of in juxtaposition, right? But I would also be interested to see what the similarities are, because I think that what happens is a lot of the time, like what's being defined, let's say we're looking at individualism as an American trait, right? Not a solely American trait. I don't think that's what's coming across, but I think it is one of these things that's sort of defining it, what you're seeing like coming into the culture, right? The road less traveled, right? I think you would find, if I'm thinking about some of the poets that you just being portrayed, right? But they would come across differently, not through trees, right? But maybe even through city landscapes, right? In the same way. And you see a lot of things where the city is a text in the same way that I'm looking at a tree as a text, right? So if I'm thinking about Ginsberg writing about a city, then, that might be addressed much in the same way that Frost addressed a forest. I haven't looked at that, but I have so many ideas just from this like 6-minute Q&A session. I'm very excited. Yeah, but I think you would find similarities in content and ideas about the traits, but like how they're being represented would be different. So I like to think function. How's the tree functioning to define this or to portray this, right? And so in that case, I would ask the same question. How does the city function, or how does the skyline function, like a forest line, for example, something like that. Yeah. Thanks.
right. Lightning has struck. We're on to our third. Thank you so much,
Thank you, everyone.
Professor Grant, and thank you for your questions, everyone. Let's now move on to Tammi Duncan-Teller, Assistant Professor of Biology at UNM-Valencia. And while she gets up her presentation, I think it's called Integrating Research into Microbiology Labs. All yours.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Tammi Duncan-Teller, and my students call me Dr. T. And I will be talking to you about integrating research into my microbiology labs here at UNM-Valencia campus. Oh, I need to go to presentation mode, don't I? There we go.
There you go.
So it starts off with my teaching philosophy. Now, I want my students to leave my classroom trusting themselves in their critical thinking processes. And I also want them to be proactive leaders of their own education. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to include that, I asked myself this question of, how do I get students to trust themselves and the process of critical thinking in microbiology for health sciences lab? And I do that by including CURE or implementing CURE. And CURE stands for Course-Based Undergraduate Research Education. And this is where we're bringing research into the curriculum as compared to a traditional research program. CURE also has been shown to boost participation, interest, retention, confidence, and motivation in science. So what my goals were in incorporating research, well, I wanted my students to apply critical thinking to the health-related topic. Most of my students are health sciences major, and the majority of them are the majority of their career goals are becoming nurses. I want my students to gain experience in teamwork and collaboration. I also wanted my students to gain research experience for their future career applications. And then most importantly, what I wanted for my students is to really see themselves as practitioners. Really learn by doing. A lot of their career goals are going to be needing that. So I did this in 4 phases, where we start off with a group-based research question, which is the overall health of an individual affected by their oral microbial diversity? And I had completed this in 4 phases. So we have the preparation phase, application, they're going to analyze and interpret their data, and at the end of this process, they're going to complete a research presentation. So the end goal is they're going to complete a full research poster, and this poster is going to have introduction, background, materials and methods, the results, figures, figure legends, discussion and conclusions, and their citations. So in completing this, I used for course design backwards planning, where I have developed a foundation of 5 CURE assignments where the main goal is to build a poster at the end. So we start off with an assignment of the first one, which is my favorite, and we just actually did this last week, is that to identify primary literature, and then to ask the students how we would do that, and then train them in what our approach would be. And then in the middle of that, we also have 2 drafts of posters where they turn it in. They turn in their first draft around mid-semester, and then their second draft is due around the, I would say, 13th or 14th week of the semester. In the middle of that, they're getting feedback from me about what they have so far in their poster, and then what they have, what they need to work on. So it's a little bit different than having sort of just one and done project where it's due at the end. They actually have multiple drafts that they can work on. So the project itself, this has been I guess it would be my 7th semester of implementation, spring of 2026. And what it had started off with was the first semester, or the first, I would say, 4 semesters. The whole goal was that students were going to isolate and identify toothbrush microbes. So what's really interesting was sample collection. It's amazing how many students had asked me, Dr. T, can we bring our cat toothbrush? And I was like, no, we are studying humans. Dr. T, can we bring in our horse toothbrush? No, we're studying humans. So they brought in their toothbrush. We use aseptic techniques to collect sample. And at the end of the semester, we completed all of the steps to sequence those bacteria, identify them, and then see how this question related back to that. So that was what happened in about the first 4 semesters. Now we have moved on from that point. So now we have 3 toothbrush microbes that were collected from fall 2023. And now we're working to determine whether they produce bacterial growth curve, and also to determine what biofilm production is. So quite honestly, today we just completed our biofilm assay. It's one of the busiest classes I've been a part of. And then just to set the scene, there's one Dr. T, and then there's 23 different minds that I'm trying to lead through this assay. And we did a pretty good job today. We got done in time. So that's what we're working on here. And at the end of this process, what happens is, at the end of the semester, students are going to synthesize and give their project presentations, their poster presentations to their families and the campus community. here on the left side is an example of one of their research posters. You see all the different components. We worked through that. And on the right side, I don't know if you notice the individual here at the bottom right, she has red boots on. Well, she's a mom, and you can see there's some balloons next to her. And these balloons says, it actually just touches my heart. It says, "You're special." And so she brought these balloons for her child. And it's pretty interesting to see how many college-age students whose parents, grandparents, children, their daughters, their sons, and they're all here for these different poster presentations. So we have them at the end of each semester, fall and spring. So some of the type of feedback that I receive for this is that generally, I have comments that research projects were enjoyable and connecting the lecture material to the lab, and that they were also unique in engaging with the overarching project. One of my favorite quotes, and this is directly from the end of the semester evaluations that we have through EvalKit. One of my favorite ones is here highlighted at the bottom, and it says, "Everything from the class to the lab was well connected. The research project sounds scary and stressful in the beginning, but with how the lab is also structured, you don't even realize you're working on your project as well as learning something new." So I thought what I liked most about that assignment or about that quotation is that it's showing me that the students, it starts off sort of scary, and at the end it's like, oh, it's not so bad after all. So it's what I really like about that. So with the end, I just want to acknowledge all of my students here. So far, I have actually been a part of 48 research posters through the 6 semesters. So I really want to thank my students, especially in the beginning semesters, with their feedback and constructive criticisms, because it led to what I am doing now. There's a lot of growing pains with that. In addition to that, I also want to thank the Expanding Course-Based Undergraduate Research Experiences Project. They hosted a summer institute in 2022 and 2023, and that's where I had received most of my training in developing the project. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I will take any questions.
Thank you, Tammy. Questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I thought it was, I really liked, by the way, your comment about helping them learn to trust their critical thinking processes. Mm-hmm. Critical thinking is something I harp on in all my classes all the time. So I like that idea of teaching them to trust their own critical thinking. So I just wanted to comment on that. But you were also talking about teaching the research question, which is something that I also teach in composition courses. I literally teach an essay called The Research Question, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, when you do that in the science course, is that like a new concept to your students as well, where they feel like this is something where they've never approached like an inquiry-based project like before? I get a lot of students in composition in that same boat, so I'm interested in the scientific perspective of it. Thanks.
Yes, this is going to be inquiry-based. It's related to the Integrate Research Center in Experiential Learning through the UNM framework of teaching. This is where we really want to bring the students, into the research project themselves. And with such a large class, 24 students and me, we start off with a group-based project. And it's pretty interesting to see at the end of the semesters just how different their research projects are. They take a lot of, they pretty much can take whatever they have learned and go in any direction that they like, which really like most. Oh, that's one of my favorite parts. I do question my sanity, though, when I am working on getting those posters edited into the final versions and then printing them out and getting them posted up. But then once I see them in the, in the hallways with their families, it's like, okay. And I've actually had many families, grandpas, grandmas, daughters, granddaughters, grandbabies. I actually saw one time a young mom, she was giving her presentation, but then her little 1-year-old little guy wouldn't let him put her down. So she was giving a presentation while her child was like poking her hair and pulling on her ear. And she just kept on, it was pretty interesting to see that.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. I have a question, Tammy.
Yes.
When you mentioned how hard the work is, and you had the EQR team so was that really where you developed the strategy for revising your courses in this way? And how long did it take you to go from how maybe you thought about classes early on to, where you are now?
Okay, that's a really great question. So with the Institute, I was a fellow for 2 summers. I think there was maybe six, I would say, if I can remember correctly, about six times we met. And there was some assignments in that, and those assignments were really developing what we wanted to have. There's different versions of research. There's full implementation, partial, or just introducing the students to it. I would say my first two, probably 3 or 4 semester, well, first 3 semesters were kind of what do you call it? Took a lot of patience because I had so many assignments and the students gave me feedback that we had so many assignments, Dr. T, like, why do we have all of this? And I'm like, okay, we can cut things down. The other large challenge that we had to overcome was working in groups. So I had started off with teams working in fours, had some feedback on not everyone pulling their weight. So now since then, I have them working in pairs with the goal, not the goal, but if they need to revert back to working as a single author, that's okay too. And a lot of the times I just make sure they communicate with me. So in the 7th semester, I have it figured out pretty well. It's a well-oiled machine. And if you guys have any questions about how you can do this in your classes, I'm happy to talk about it. And just a shameless plug, I'm actually going to be with 2 other colleagues. We're going to be talking specifically about this during the spring 2026 teaching conference. So we'll be part of that.
That's great. Yeah, look out for that. That's the CTL Spring Teaching Conference in April. So thank you for participating in that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so we move now to Josh Wright, who is faculty and chair of health sciences at UNM-Taos, whose presentation, I think both literally and figuratively, is worth 1,000 words.
Thank you for that introduction. Yes, worth 1,000 words, but only 7 minutes to get them all out.
There you go.
But I'm going to use an alternate approach to get these things across. And this is a good complement to Dr. T's presentation about what she does in the lab. This is going to focus a little bit more about what happens with lecture and in the classroom and some alternative approaches to improve standard lecture. So 7 minutes to do this. I'm hoping that I can help some of you out who teach and maybe have some struggles with this. So I'm going to offer some tips and tricks to improve learning, engagement, retention, comprehension, and I'm going to cover 2 different sort of components, and there are about 100 others, but these are 2 that I picked that I think are particularly effective. So first, I'm going to talk about drawing as a learning device, and then we'll look at ways to improve straight up lecture. So if this is you, if you've asked yourself this question, there isn't enough time to get through everything. I tried everything. They still missed those questions on the test. I covered that multiple times and they still don't get it. I can't believe they still don't get it. There isn't time for me to put in a bunch of fancy learning activities. I just don't have the time. And if you have ever been that instructor, especially new instructors, and you're bashing your head against the proverbial chalkboard, I want to first remind you that just because we tell them, just because we show them in a PowerPoint, just because we point out where they can find it in the book, doesn't mean that they understand. It doesn't mean that they've retained anything. So we need to find some other ways to get it. So this slide is or was my failure. This is where I ran into all kinds of problems, and we're talking about neurons here. So this slide shows just a partial list of the learning outcomes for understanding the anatomy and physiology of neurons. And I didn't tell you, I teach anatomy and physiology. And so I thought I was a good presenter, a good at discussion. And it turned out that I wasn't doing that well, at least in terms of the actual outcomes. So on the exam that covered neurons, for the topic around neurons, only about 60% of my students were getting these questions right. And this is despite my best efforts. So I tried something new. And I had them, instead of me standing up there and telling them about neurons, I had them draw diagrams, label diagrams, make cartoons about how things work. And this was great. I got up success rate for this topic on the exam up to 80%. So that's a significant improvement. However, the problem was this took a significant amount of class time. So then I thought, well, neurons are, there's a lot to them. They're very complex. So what if we sort of did a divide and conquer, and I'd split students up into teams, where one team would cover saltatory conduction and another team would cover supporting cells, glial cells. And then at the end, they would teach each other, and they would, so they could focus on different things. And this also gave me about 80%, which is good. That's great for a difficult topic. However, it still took a lot of class time. So then I pre-recorded the lecture and had them watch my lecture at home before the class period. And then we spent almost the entirety of the class period with them making these diagrams, and they could do a much deeper dive. And I'm there walking around the room, and they have learning objectives that they have to hit each of those learning objectives with their diagrams. And now this is what we do now, and we're consistently above 90% success for this very difficult topic. And like Dr. T, my students are, 80% of them are pre-nursing. So understanding how neurons function is really important for going into nursing school. So it worked. This was a success. So I've got some pictures of students starting their work on their neuron diagrams. Here's some more. This is last fall, working on their diagrams. Here's some close-ups of the diagrams. And, if any of you know anything about neuron physiology and anatomy, this is pretty comprehensive and actually quite sophisticated. There's a huge amount of information here. And what's important is when they draw these things out, they start to understand much better than looking at the textbook and reading the textbook and listening to me talk about it. And this one goes even deeper in a lot of these topics. And what's more is the students that do this, they could then teach somebody about it and actually do a very good job of it. So they can teach each other and they can discuss it with each other. So anyway, they don't struggle anymore with this topic. They're rocking the exam. And the most common response I get, by the way, this photograph is probably a bit of an exaggeration. They're not quite that happy, but they're pretty happy. And they say, now I get it. And these are students that really struggle with this topic, but just doing this one activity helps to bring it home for them. So my sort of advice and my encouragement for you out there, and it's not just this drawing exercise. So many of you might not have classrooms with lots of whiteboard space to do an activity like this. And I'm not telling you don't do PowerPoint lecture. And actually, there's evidence that shows that it's equivalent to other lecture, despite what an earlier study said. But there are a lot of ways that we can improve engagement, retention, and understanding. Lots of evidence-based approaches that have shown real results that don't necessarily take that much effort on our part. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel to make a difference. So PowerPoint lecture, for example, there are some best practices, accepted best practices, and a lot of these are evidence-based best practices. I've got a few of them up here, but there's a long list. And I do have some resources at the end that you guys can look through. Pre-test, post-test for either PowerPoint or traditional lecture. There's evidence to show significant improvement with attention, retention, engagement, and understanding. So a pre-test before the lecture can really help them to have questions in their mind that they couldn't understand get answered through that lecture and it's floating around in their brain, so it forces them to engage a little bit more. There's other ways to promote active listening, create lecture worksheets for them, turn the learning objectives into questions that they answer. And when you get to the end of a section of a lecture, you can check, where are we with our worksheets? If there's something that I didn't cover, or one of these learning objectives I didn't hit, let's discuss it. For the longer lectures, at least one activity in the middle or towards the end can help a lot. And it doesn't have to be a meaningful learning activity. It can be anything that just gets them engaged in a different way, gets them on their feet, or gets them talking to each other, gets them asking questions. And here's one not to forget, is for longer lectures, breaks every 50 minutes. So evidence shows that this improves attention, retention, engagement, and also student happiness, which is a very important metric. If we give them a decent break about every 50 minutes or less. And then the big point is, the more students do, the better, instead of just sitting back and passively listening. So this is a very doable thing. Whether it's the drawing thing, there's a lot of other things, student projects. So Dr. T, that was a great example of student project. Diagramming, as we talked about, storyboarding, making comic books of things, of complex processes, concept mapping, drawing. There's a million ways to get at the same thing. And a lot of instructors, I find, are nervous about like removing 45 minutes of their lecture time to do an activity, because you can't cover as many topics in an activity as you can. But I promise you that it is so much more effective, and there's creative ways to find the time to fit that stuff in. So if you want to learn more about this, my email is very easy to remember, jwrong@unm.edu. If you send me an email, I will very happily share this PowerPoint, which has on this slide links to a lot of the resources just for these two topics about improving learning and engagement. And there's literally 100 more sort of ways to go about it. And now I will open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's great.
Got a question, Chris, for Josh? Josh, I'd just like to compliment you on this, and I use some of your techniques in human evolution, biological anthropology. When we have our lab, we use cranial identification for species. And the students have a really hard time when I describe the species, but when they can put their hands on them, they're also supposed to draw every single one of them as part of a retention process, because then they have a practicum later where they have to identify them and a series of facts for each. And special students get to do an exercise called Who Am I?, which is that they have to quiz their fellow students with these facts and see if they can figure out what species they're talking about, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, whatever it might be. And I found that's very effective, particularly when they take their tests. And, before I was doing this, I was around 60%. Now I'm up over 90 in terms of retention and success on their lab practicum. So thank you for that. I think that's a lot of good ideas there.
Yeah, thanks. And get creative. I mean, and sometimes, Dr. T mentioned that she struggled, her first couple of iterations, and she made improvements. And the same has been true. Trial and error. It takes a number of tries and sort of different approaches, and you'll find things that work.
Tammi.
Oh, I have a question. First off, no, thank you for your talk. My question to you is, have you completed any assessments that would that measures the impacts of your neuron activity?
Well, yeah. So their exam scores for the exam that covers that. And the reason I picked that out is because that was just the lowest part of the exam. So I could break it up into which concepts are they struggling with the most. And the scores have consistently now, when we do this activity, consistently above 90%. for that particular topic. And so when you have that most difficult concept that's both important but also really difficult to grasp, I think those are the things that maybe to start throwing these ideas at and finding different ways to approach it. And it's worth the effort, I think, in the long run, but you might have to have a few trial and error periods and maybe some failures and some stutter steps before you get there.
Thank you.
We will, for those of you who are willing to share your slides, we can send it out to the participant list. So if you're willing to do that, that would be great. So Hannah has a snapshot of everybody who participated. We can reach out to them. And so Hannah will be in contact with all the 4 presenters today to see if they're willing to do that. And because you have so many great resources and references as well that people can follow up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share.
Great. Appreciate it. Well, I can't thank you enough for providing some stimulation on a kind of dreary and blustery day at the end of the day. Thank you all for your presentations, and really look forward to seeing where your work takes you in the future, and for doing our UNM campus proud. So thank you for all your work.